Every single empire that has ever collapsed, Rome, the Ottomans, the Spanish, the British, the Soviets, they all made the same economic mistake. Not the same war, not the same enemy, not the same disease. The same move, and the terrifying part, every single one of them knew they were doing it. And they did it anyway. Because when you're the most powerful civilization on Earth, you believe the rules don't apply to you. They were wrong. Every single time. Before we get to the move, I need you to understand what an empire actually is. Not in the political textbook sense, in the economic sense, because that's the only way the story makes sense. An empire is not just a country with a big army. An army is expensive. You need something to pay for the army. An empire is a money machine. At its core, every empire in history was built on the same foundation: control of resources, control of trade, and control of the currency. That's it. The Romans controlled Mediterranean trade routes, the Spanish controlled South American silver and gold, the British controlled cotton, spices, and eventually the global banking system. The Americans controlled oil pricing through the petrodollar. When an empire controls all three, resources, trade, and currency, it generates enormous wealth with relatively little effort. Tribute flows in, taxes flow in, the center gets rich while the edges do the work. And here's the key thing. When you are that rich, that powerful, and that dominant, you start to believe something dangerous. You start to believe you can spend without consequence. And that belief, that single arrogant economic assumption, is what kills empires. Not armies, not plagues, not rebellions. The belief that you are too big to fail financially. That's the move. Currency debasement. Every collapsing empire did it. Every single one. Now, if that word sounds technical, don't worry. I'm going to break it down so clearly that you'll never look at your own money the same way again. Here's the basic idea. In the ancient world, money had real physical value. A Roman coin called the denarius was made of silver. Pure silver. When you held a denarius, you held actual wealth in your hand. But running an empire is expensive. Wars are expensive. Infrastructure is expensive. Keeping the population happy, bread, entertainment, bureaucrats. All of it costs money. So here's what Rome did. They took the silver coins, they melted them down, and when they recast them, they mixed in a little copper, a little less silver per coin, but they printed more coins. So technically, the treasury had more money. More coins, more numbers. But the actual value, the real purchasing power of each coin, had dropped. Now here's where it gets interesting. At first, nobody noticed. Life went on. The empire kept expanding. The coins still bought food, weapons, wine. But slowly, over years, sometimes decades, merchants started noticing that prices were rising. A loaf of bread that cost 1 denarius now cost 2, then 4, then 10. Sound familiar? Yeah. We have a word for that today. We call it inflation. But back then, they didn't fully understand why it was happening. They just knew things were getting more expensive. And they blamed merchants, they blamed foreigners. They never looked at the coin in their own hand. The Emperor Nero reduced the silver content of the denarius to around 90%. His successors kept going. By the time of Emperor Gallienus, about 260 AD, the denarius had a silver content of less than 5%. Let me say that again. What was once a pure silver coin was now 95% copper, just coated in a thin wash of silver to look valuable. The coin was a lie. The Roman economy knew it was a lie. Prices exploded. Soldiers demanded higher pay because their wages bought less and less. Farmers stopped accepting Roman coins and started bartering. Trade routes, the lifeline of the empire, started breaking down. The money machine stopped working. And once the money machine stops working, everything else follows. Now, here's where most history channels stop. They tell you the Rome story, show you some crumbling columns, call it a day. But I need you to see the pattern, because Rome was not a unique case. Rome was a template, and what terrifies me, genuinely, is how many times this exact template has been repeated. The Ottoman Empire at its peak was one of the most sophisticated economic powers on Earth. They controlled the trade routes between Europe and Asia. Silk, spices, gold. All of it passed through Ottoman hands. But by the 1700s, the empire was stretched thin, wars on multiple fronts, a growing bureaucracy, a janissary military class that demanded more and more payment. Sound familiar? The Ottomans did exactly what Rome did. They debased their currency, the akçe. They reduced the silver content. They printed more. Prices rose. The economy weakened. But here's where the Ottoman story takes a dark turn that Rome didn't quite have. When the Ottoman currency lost value, European merchants, particularly British and French, started offering trade in their currencies. Harder currencies, more stable ones. The Ottomans went from controlling trade to being dependent on European financial systems. They borrowed money from European banks, at interest, and when they couldn't pay, which they couldn't because their own economy was collapsing, the Europeans stepped in. They didn't invade with armies at first, they invaded with debt. The Ottoman Empire spent its final century financially occupied by the very merchants it once dominated. Now the Spanish story, this one is my personal favorite, because it feels like a cruel joke from history. The Spanish did something Rome and the Ottomans didn't do. They didn't reduce their coins. They had actual gold. Mountains of it. Boatloads of it. Literally sailing from the Americas. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported more gold and silver from the New World than the entire previous world history of European gold reserves. They were drowning in precious metal. So how did they collapse? Too much money. Here's the thing about flooding an economy with currency, even real gold currency. If you flood it too fast, prices still rise, because there's suddenly more money chasing the same amount of goods. The Spanish called it the price revolution. Historians today recognize it as one of the earliest recorded cases of hyperinflation caused by monetary oversupply. Spanish merchants found that their gold bought less and less within Spain. Manufacturing became expensive. Labor costs rose. Spanish goods became too costly to compete with Dutch and English products. Spain became rich and uncompetitive at the same time. They stopped making things. They started buying things with their gold. And the gold, every last ounce of it, slowly flowed out of Spain and into the hands of the Dutch and British merchants who were actually producing goods. Spain mined the wealth of an entire continent and handed it to their competitors. By 1650, Spain was in debt. By 1700, they were a secondary power. The gold was gone. The British case is the most important one for us today because it's the closest mirror to the modern world. By the 1800s, Britain didn't just dominate trade, they dominated the financial system itself. The British pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. Every major trade in the world was settled in pounds. British banks financed entire nations. This is the most powerful economic position an empire can hold, and Britain held it for nearly 150 years. But then came the World Wars, 2 wars back-to-back, separated by a brutal depression. Britain spent everything. They borrowed from America. They sold off foreign assets. They ran massive deficits. And here's the critical moment. The moment the British Empire effectively ended, even though nobody announced it. Britain abandoned the gold standard. The pound was no longer backed by a fixed amount of gold. It was now backed by the promise of the British government. In one policy decision, made in a state of financial desperation, Britain transformed its currency from a store of value into a political instrument. The world noticed. Slowly. Then all at once, by 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, the world decided to anchor global finance to the US dollar instead of the British pound. Britain didn't lose its empire in a war, it lost it in a currency conference in New Hampshire. The military empire lasted a few more decades, but the economic empire ended in 1931, the moment they debased their currency under financial pressure. So now you've seen the pattern. Rome, the Ottomans, Spain, Britain, different centuries, different continents, different enemies, different circumstances, same move, same result. But I want to go deeper, because I don't want you to just know this pattern. I want you to understand the mechanism. Why does currency debasement always lead to collapse? What is the actual chain reaction? Every empire that debases its currency does so for the same reason. Fiscal desperation, bureaucratic bloat, welfare programs to keep the population loyal, infrastructure decay, the costs grow, the revenue doesn't keep up, and rather than make hard choices, cutting spending, raising taxes on the powerful, restructuring the economy, the empire takes the easy path. They print more money, or dilute the coins, or borrow against the currency. It's the political path of least resistance. It requires no courage, it kicks the problem to the next administration. And here's what's important. The people making this decision are not stupid. They know what they're doing. Rome's finance ministers knew. Britain's treasury officials knew. They understood, at some level, the risks. But the alternative, genuine fiscal reform, cutting military spending, acknowledging weakness, felt politically impossible. So they chose slow poison over immediate pain. Here's why the move is so seductive. It works. For a while, Rome debased the denarius and paid its armies. The armies won battles. The empire expanded. For decades after the first debasement, Rome looked stronger than ever. Britain abandoned the gold standard and stabilized its immediate financial crisis. The economy continued. People went to work. The empire, superficially, held together. The short-term win is real, and it makes it impossibly difficult for future leaders to reverse course, because the reversal would be painful, and the debasement has been working. This is the trap. The move buys time, but every dose requires a larger dose next time. Here's where it starts falling apart. Quietly, slowly, at the edges. The merchants notice first. Traders who deal in multiple currencies, who move goods across borders, who think in terms of purchasing power, they start to see the coins aren't worth what they used to be. They adjust prices upward. They start demanding more coins for the same goods. Then the foreign powers notice. When Rome's coins lost silver content, Persian and Indian traders started demanding payment in Persian coins, or in direct goods. The Roman brand lost its premium. When the British pound started wavering, Middle Eastern oil states started wondering if they should price oil in dollars instead. And here's the dark truth about reserve currency status. Once you start losing it, the process accelerates. Because trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. This is the part that seals the empire's fate. Once prices start rising due to currency debasement, here's what happens. Workers demand higher wages to afford basic goods. Merchants raise prices further to compensate for rising costs. The government now has to spend more of its debased currency to maintain the same level of services and military power, so they debase further, which causes more inflation, which requires more wages, which requires more debasement. The Romans called this period the crisis of the 3rd century. In just 50 years, Rome had 26 different emperors. Most were assassinated, because the economy was in freefall and every emperor tried to solve it with the same tool that caused it. More spending, more debasement, more inflation. This is the end stage. When citizens and merchants lose confidence in the currency, they start moving wealth out. The wealthy Romans transferred assets to estates outside the city, to land rather than coins, to gold hoarded in walls. The wealthy Ottomans moved capital into European banks. The British saw foreign nations move their gold reserves to New York. When capital flees, the investment that drives growth disappears. Industries shrink. Tax revenues collapse further. The military can't be paid. The borders weaken. And the empire, which looked so powerful just decades before, suddenly finds it cannot hold its periphery. The rebellions come, the invasions come, but they succeed only because the economic foundation was already rubble. The armies didn't fail Rome, the coins did. Now here's the part that I find genuinely unsettling. Every empire I've described had a moment, a specific identifiable moment, where the choice was made. Not a moment of crisis, a moment before the crisis, when the empire was still powerful, still respected, still capable of choosing a different path. Rome could have restructured its tax system under Diocletian. He actually tried. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, the ancient world's version of price controls. It failed. But the attempt showed they understood the problem. Britain in the 1920s had economists, including John Maynard Keynes, screaming that returning to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate was suicide. Churchill ignored them. The overvalued pound strangled British exports for a decade before the inevitable 1931 break. They knew, and they still did it anyway. Because here's the brutal reality of imperial economics. By the time the fiscal crisis is severe enough to force action, the political will to take real action has usually already died. The powerful interests that benefit from continued spending, the military contractors, the bureaucrats, the political class, they block reform. The population, conditioned to expect empire-level benefits, resists austerity. And the leaders, focused on their own political survival, choose the short-term solution that keeps them in power today, even if it destroys the empire tomorrow. And here's the pattern inside the pattern. The final leaders of every collapsing empire were often not bad people or even particularly incompetent. The last serious Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was a teenager. He inherited a broken system. He had no real power. The economy had already been destroyed by his predecessors. The last Ottoman sultans were modernizers. They built railways. They reformed the legal code. They desperately tried to restructure the economy. But reforms that come after the currency has collapsed are like trying to rebuild a burning building while it's still on fire. The window for action is always earlier than leaders think, and it always closes faster than they expect. So what is the actual lesson here? Not just, don't debase your currency. That's too simple. The real lesson is this. Economic power is built on trust, and trust, once systematically destroyed by the people who hold it, cannot be rebuilt within the same system. The Roman citizens stopped trusting the denarius. The Ottoman merchants stopped trusting the akçe. The world stopped trusting the British pound. In each case, by the time the people in charge admitted the problem, the alternative system had already formed around them. Persian coins replaced the denarius on Eastern trade routes. European banks replaced the Ottoman financial system. The US dollar replaced the pound sterling. The empire doesn't end with an invasion. It ends the day the world decides, quietly, through a million individual economic decisions, that it no longer needs the empire's money. That day always comes. And it always comes before the official historians record the fall, because by the time the historians write it down, the merchants already moved on. And here's the thought I want to leave you with. Every empire believed, genuinely believed, that their situation was different, that their currency was special, that their military was strong enough to enforce the value of their money. That their moment in history was the exception to every rule. None of them were right. History has a long memory, and it shows no favoritism. If you've made it this far, thank you, genuinely, because most people who watch history content want the drama, the battles, the betrayals, the burning of cities, but you stayed for the mechanism, for the why behind the collapse. And that tells me something about you. You're not here to be entertained by history. You're here to understand it. That's exactly why this channel exists. Finance Historian is not about making history simple. It's about making it clear. Because the financial forces that built and destroyed the Roman Empire, they're the same forces moving through the global economy right now. The names have changed, the technology has changed, but the human behavior, the arrogance, the short-termism, the belief that this time is different, that has not changed. If you want to be the kind of person who understands why the world works the way it does, not just what's happening, but why it's happening and where it leads, then subscribe to this channel. Not because I'll tell you what to think, but because I'll give you the historical context that most financial commentators don't have, or don't bother to share. Every generation inherits the economic decisions of the generation before it. The only question is, will you understand those decisions clearly enough to see what comes next?